Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and dzień dobry to everybody who has the chance to be here this evening. It is a pleasure for me to be part of this kind of meeting of young researchers with these many concerns to share, and I hope I'm also, as later participants, bringing in a topic that disturbs the kind of usual monolithic approaches to the European medieval ages, which may truly be the purpose of this conference. So, I'm Ana Medina. I'm a master's student in archaeology by the University of Granada in Spain, and it's been almost 2 years since I began training in the study of archaeological animal records. Till this very day, the practice definition of zooarchaeological discipline I'm approaching implies, aside of the natural assessing of the ancient animal population, the expression of historical conditions through its remains. And so my way of working has started ever since with predisposing myself on an historical dilemma or question I have myself, and then assisting to the zooarchaeological context and methods that will likely provide the best answer to it. And that's even the very structure of the presentation. So, referring to this, my early work or early interest, they are clearly orbiting around the social implications of the past animal consumption as one of the many human-animal relations archaeology may consider. As I say, not specifically in terms of breeding, bone, or textile technology, but in the transformation of the food resource, in creating and considering an item able to be eaten up. And for this line of research, if I think, or if we all think of the alimentary constructions as essentially social phenomena, there is identity linked to the consuming patterns, for it joins in the generation of taste, collective cohesion, territory vinculations, and for the topic today I want to present, religion. If we attend to the central medieval ages in the Iberian Peninsula, and a few centuries forward actually, religion became and persisted as a basic order for life. And because of such conjuncture, we should be able to access to a privileged understanding of that statement I said before, that food identity may correlate to the religious identity in an historical perspective. Most specifically, noticing that in Iberia, there is a scenario of coexistence between three religions with three different approaches to animal food acquisition. The constantly changing environment of the Iberian Peninsula during the medieval ages consisted of the persistent turbulence of the majoritarian Christendom against the Islamdom, but also a face-up between the socioeconomic of each and the always minority Jewish population that lived here. And these Jewish population were sometimes tolerated under the so-called dima condition, where these people, wherever they lived, had to pay a tax for professing a religion other than the main in that territory, but over time, Jewish population became highly rejected until an issue of expulsion in late 15th century. Now, underneath lies that these three book religions in the Iberian Peninsula followed three distinctive religious paths of deity perceptions. The Islamic, alongside with the Jewish, has a detailed subscription on how to approach the animal consumption, determine which species, how has to be the slaughter, the butchery, and it appears in the sacred book or lectures of each. Meanwhile, the Christian doesn't contain these types of lectures on his religious scripted repertoire. So, a discussion of synergies or confrontations between religiosity, but foremost between these subjects and communities, is made up by noticing in historical medieval sources, but also archaeological, how the religious groups confirm and conform themselves by following the religious prescription. And so I believe animal consumption must have become the most common ritual or religious practice because of its dailiness and quotidian character, and must have been the most important mechanism of self-affirmation and self-consciousness on this time, especially in the minoritarian environments. So that's why I'm attending to the medieval Jewish communities to test this out somehow. The social strategies to accomplish the religious demand can be reflected in some documentary testimonies, but if we attend exclusively to the archaeological sites, the record that is more representative or that appears more frequently are the animal-borne record as a result of the food waste on this context. And this exposes to archaeology as an essential methodology for this research, and the Jewish quarter as the ideal place to begin. This archaeological analysis is able to generate so much data of different kinds, but these are the three methods as I show you that I've been focusing on, which are somehow common to any archaeological study, actually. The taxa of the sample, which refers to the animal species representation, anatomic distribution, that means highlighting which skeleton parts are more frequent in the sample, and last, the butchery marks or patterns, meaning the detection of chops or cuts in the bone surface with an intention of dismembering, filleting, or so on. I have the chance to work with the animal records from Atienza's Cerro de la Judería, translated as the Jewish quarter hill of Atienza. The whole village history is actually yet particular, for it was a medieval frontier enclave where Islamics and Christians several times fought and altered the dues, as it is reflected by the occupation of the other main hill of Atienza, which is the one that is established, the castle. But the hill of El Cerro de la Judería will represent the parallel history of a Jewish community affected by this course of changes during the 13th to 14th century, if there was the ability to detect, in fact, the presence of a Jewish population living here. And the framework of the Rethink the Medieval Ring Revolution project is making it possible to continue the extensive research of this site that started in 2022, including my first approach to its animal records, looking to define somehow a Jewishness in the consumption patterns. The materials I'm still processing belong to a well-delimited stratigraphic unit, delimited chronologically to the late medieval ages, and especially because it is reduced to a single room. And this sample has contained a proportional number of identified specimens, of which 320 remains were the ones that made possible making a lecture on the taxa, anatomic, and battery representation of the sample. The results I've obtained with specialist assistance solely can assist to provide some initial explanation of the historical phenomena as I present here, because by verifying the taxa representation, we may approximate to what I call the intolerance stress, indicating the selective or total provision of the food resource as the Jewish lectures dictates. And because the consumption may afford or may have not afford to be as specific as it is predisposed on the lectures, that may point out a situation of stability or crisis of these people. Next, we have the socioeconomic status, which I approximated by studying the differential access to the mid portions, the preference for certain anatomical parts, and so by comparison with other context and other lectures. And lastly, the technical capacities, referring to the so-called Jewish battery, which is the standardization or absence of certain butchery signs that we'll see in a moment. And without further ado, I now present the results, which I've compiled following the canonical statement I've considered, extracted from Quranic, historical, and even ethnographic sources of all the Jewish animal consumption, and using these sources to serve the approaching exercise to making a lecture on the evidence of El Cero de la Judería. First of all, kashrut needs to be explained. Kashrut appears in the sacred text pointing what is good or adequate in general in Jewish religion, but it is mostly used for labeling the only appropriate relation the Jewish people must have with the creatures of God's creation. And in this sense, for an animal to be kosher, it must belong to the allowed species, but also for the later process, it must be transformed correctly, as also dictated, into edible. And so kashrut agreements, therefore, will actually underlay all the food process to make the meal. Chapters from the Torah and Talmud expose the forbidden and permitted animals to consume. The basic ones are found under these three statements: that Jewish people must eat what ruminates and has a cloven hoof, referring to all the caprids and bovids. All the poultry is permitted for the Jewish people to eat, excluding raptor birds, for what the ancestry form, the goose, represents the exception. And in third place, Jewish people may eat any aquatic animals that has easy striping scales. So, if we are in a Jewish quarter, we should therefore find these criteria followed by the absence of the forbidden species, which are the pigs, the rabbits, the animal that doesn't meet the requirements. And in Atienza, as we can see, there is in fact a kosher animal consumption if we look at the taxa composition of the room unit sample. And I thought it was remarkable to see how we can attend to a community capable of following the prescription and do it not only flawlessly, but with a special emphasis on goat and goose. Next. in order to preserve the kosher character on the meat, this meat must be also low fat, blood cleaned, and should not be consumed with dairy products in the same meal. Some passages from the Torah reveals this condition, especially the one that involves the fat or tallow consumption, urging to maintain it under any circumstance. And that's why we should attend to a consumption preference for the top quarters in Jewish meals. For these are the ones with less fat, with the absence of great blood vessels, because if we aren't able to consume the top quarters, there must be specialized mechanisms, as it's the Jewish butchery, to remove all the problematic fat tissue and veins. So this indicator, as I intended before, may help to identify the ability of this population to acquire the most fibrous meat, which shall be related to the economic status of them. If the animal is not regularly consumed, but only the preferred parts, as indeed happens in Atienza, it may later represent the presence of a community that can afford to be exquisite on its consumption. And lastly, the Jewish butchery patterns, or also defined as Nikur practices. They are a specialized technique Jewish people seems to have to remove all the problematic tissue and veins in the back quarters, including the fat, the sciatic nerves, among some others I'm still discussing myself. And all the Nikur practices are applied to the meat portion after the slaughter of the animal. To recapitulate all the process, there might be a slaughter man with another skilled man that will approach the animal once it's dead, and for extracting its meat portions, and will make sure it was killed by human hand exclusively and it's been almost fully bled out. After the dismemberment and several checkings, a butcher man, which will be the one that applies the nikur, will reduce the meat portions into fillets to sell them on the butchery. But lastly, at home, the person that cooks the daily meals will also make sure to remove the rest of the marginal fat, to salt the meat well so the rest of the blood can be fully removed, and this cook, usually woman, will be the last kashrut ruler before the consumption. And this meat processing finds canonically in the menaker activity, which is the butcher activity, peculiar traces known as the purging marks, which are the traces of the extraction of forbidden fat and nerves in the bone surface. Spotting these scratching traces in Atienza's bones may imply the existence of a skilled butcher providing to the community clean meat portions to buy. And on the contrary, the lack of them, as well as the absence of several chopping or cutting patterns, may later suggest that this meat processing happens at home. So, my preliminary interpretations on this subject are that there may be in Atienza a well-established Jewish community because they profess all the kashrut discipline flawlessly, as I see. There also be a Jewish community with the ability to access to the preferred anatomic portions that may be with a mechanism of market, or I have to think about this, but this is the first idea I had in mind. And also, we've attended to the absence of nikur traces in the bone surface, which are suppressive because there might be either a low specialized butchery or that the processing of the meat happens at home. So, what are the conclusions I've extracted from my work on this? Are that the alimentary identity is a great and interesting historical category of analysis, that this is a young and a potential line of research for medieval archaeology in general, specifically in the Iberian Peninsula, and that we have somehow a pending subject in the discipline in general with treating how we study men as community and the feminine agency in all the identity process and dynamics. And these are the things I'm expecting to develop more in a future PhD, but I'm not going to stop much in that. If we had the time, I had a photo album, but never mind. That's it, actually. I can pass it through
Thank you, Anna. That was great.
Yeah. Thank you.
So we're sticking with zoo archaeology and dialect for the next paper. This time we're moving to Serbia. The paper is by Przyjaciół and Maya Kokanovic. But you'll take over. Maya is 50 plus. Okay, so.
Okay. Thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Maya Kokanovic and I'm coming from Biosense Institute. And today I will present to you new zooarchaeological results from medieval site in Serbia. Gradina Erčege site is located in the Erčege village on the southeastern slopes of Javor mountain in the Ivanjica municipality of southwestern Serbia. Historical sources do not mention this fortification and its name has remained unknown. The only data originating from the 19th century are historically unconfirmed legends that correlate the fortress with local medieval noblemen. The site is dated to the 14th or 15th century according to archaeological material. The fortress has an almost rectangular shape and it's divided into two almost equal halves with a partition wall. Rectangular towers dominated both the western and eastern end of the fortification, while the third tower was located in the middle of the partition wall. Archaeological researches were carried out in 2009 to gather the main data about the time of creation of the fortification and its main stratigraphy, and to determine its appearance. In addition to pottery, stone and metal finds, animal bones have also been discovered. The samples derived from the 2009 campaign are a subject of this presentation. The faunal sample collected from the Gradine Erčege site mostly comes from the cultural layer and Tower 2. The standard archaeological analysis included primarily taxonomic determination and the recording of taphonomic changes such as intensity of damage to the periosteum, which was reflected in the surface decay of bones. In the case of skeletal elements that were exposed to fire, the intensity of burning was recorded, as well as the presence of traces of gnawing by carnivores. Age determination was carried out according to the tooth eruption and attrition, as well as the degree of long bone epiphyseal fusion. Butchery patterns have also been recorded, which include any procedure performed with knife and cleavers by humans, intending to adapt the meat of slaughtered animals to human consumption. If were present, the paleopathological changes were noted and described. As mentioned, the degree of fragmentation was very high, and whole bones represent only 21% of the sample. The fragmentation was probably the consequence of human activities, such as breaking bones to obtain bone marrow and animal butchery. This is confirmed by the fact that the most numerous whole bones were those which are not suitable for processing. And that are being discarded during the butchery, and which are not rich in meat, such as isolated teeth, carpal and tarsal bones, as well as phalanx. Traces of gnawing were present on 5% of specimens. Burning marks were noticed on 1% of specimens, which could indicate the preparation of food, but some of them could be accidentally burnt. Traces of weathering are present on 7% of specimen, suggesting that the bones were not quickly deposited in sediment. Due to the high degree of fragmentation, 670 specimens were identified to the species or genus level, which is 37% of the whole sample. Skeletal remains of the mammals from the majority of these finds, while the domestic mammals were the most numerous among them. Among domestic species, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, equids, and cats are present. Whereas among the wild animals, there were wild boar, red deer, roe deer, lynx, and hare. Faunal remains of birds consisted of domestic chicken, geese, and peacocks, while among the fish, one specimen of beluga sturgeon is discovered. Domestic mammals had a very significant role in the lives of the medieval people. Therefore, Gradina Ercege fits this pattern, since domestic mammals make about 96% of number of identified specimens. Among them, the most numerous were the remains of sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. The most represented species in the faunal assemblage were sheep and goats, making up 47% of the total sample. Sheep remains occur more frequently than goat remains in ratio of 9 to 10. According to distribution of skeletal elements of sheep and goats, it could be concluded that the slaughtering of these animals was carried out at the site. Butchering marks were noticed on the 24% of number of identified specimens, and marks were inflicted by metal tools like knives and cleavers or axes during the horning and skinning, disarticulation of carcass, meat filleting, and bone marrow extraction. The second most important species in the faunal assemblage was cattle, making up 29% of the total sample. According to the distribution of skeletal elements of cattle, it could be concluded that the slaughtering of these species was carried out at the site. Butchering marks were noticed on 36% of number of identified specimens. And the marks were inflicted by metal tools such as knives and cleavers or axes during the dehorning and skinning, and also disarticulation of skeleton, meat filleting, and bone marrow extraction. In the faunal assemblage from Gradina Ercege site, pigs make up 15% of the total sample. According to the distribution of skeletal elements of pig, pigs, it could be concluded that the slaughtering of these animals was carried out at the site. Butchering marks were noticed on 25% of number of identified specimens, and marks were inflicted by metal tools like knives and cleavers and or axes during the skinning, disarticulation of the carcass, and meat filleting. The mortality data of sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs based on time of eruption and attrition of the teeth and the epiphyseal fusion of long bones are shown in this figure. Age of death indicates that cattle and caprines were primarily bred for meat exploitation, since there is a high number of young and sub-adult individuals represented in the sample. The presence of adult individuals suggests that secondary products of this species were also exploited. Pigs were mainly slaughtered between the first and the third year of age, while the presence of the adult individuals suggests that some of them were bred longer for reproduction. The meat of calves, lambs, and piglets was also used in diet. Among equids, only the horse is confirmed, while the rest of the specimens were determined to genus level. Some of the equid bones carried butchery marks, suggesting that equid meat was occasionally used in diet. Most of specimens belong to adult individuals. Wild animals are rare, and they are represented by about 4%. Among them, remains of wild boar, red deer, roe deer, lynx, and hare were noted. Butchery marks were present on all mentioned species, and they are inflicted during the process of the horning and skinning, disarticulation of carcass, and meat filleting. Among the remains of birds, bones of chickens, geese, and peacocks were confirmed. Age data suggests that adult individuals are mostly present, which suggests that the exploitation of eggs and feathers was aside from meat. Meat exploitation is further confirmed by butchery marks noted on chicken and peacock bones. Only one bone fish was discovered on the site. It is the fragmented pectoral spine of the beluga sturgeon fish that suggests long-distance trade of inhabitants of this settlement with the fisheries on the Danube. In Serbia and Central Europe, the presence of sturgeons is associated with high-status settlements. Therefore, this discovery might suggest the presence of a high-status individual within the fortress. Historical sources and zoological data point out that in medieval Serbia, domestic animals were very important, and they were mainly bred for diet purposes, for exploitation of meat, fat, and milk. They were also used for the exploitation of wool or hair and skin for the clothing industry and agriculture. Dogs were used for hunting and as guard dogs, while horses were used for transport, riding, welfare purposes, and sometimes for diet. Poultry, meat, and eggs was also used in diet, but in smaller quantities, and exploitation of feathers could have also been considered. Wild animals contributed to the diet as well, and some of them were hunted for fur exploitation. Aquatic resources were also exploited, indicated by the fish remains. Gradina Erčege site fits into the wider picture of animal exploitation in medieval Serbia, with certain exceptions. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Move the last presentation to the tomorrow research, still like maybe 10 minutes more past discussion, but then we can do it online meeting of our committee, so we need to have Okay, so questions for